Welcome to the second lesson. I hope you enjoyed the first lesson and I hope you had some time to digest it, because I know it is full of new information, lots of provocative thoughts, so you need to give it some time to really do its work, and you may want to look at the videos a few times. Now, in the second lesson, we'll talk about the question, why do people have sex? And it's actually the core of this whole course, so you really need to understand this lesson very, very well before moving to the next one. Because have you actually ever thought, like, why do you have sex? Are you aware of it? Are you conscious of the motivations of why you have sex? Or does it just happen? It's like very instinctive, very reactive. So actually, maybe before you go further, you may want to pause this video, take a piece of paper and just try to put down some thoughts like, why do you have sex? Now, the point is that if you know why you have sex, if you're really conscious about it, then the likelihood to be dissatisfied with your sex life is going to be very limited. Because we think we know we have sex, but most likely it's just some kind of pure rationalization or just trying to be conformed to the ideology of our time. So really, this lesson is crucial. If you do not understand this lesson, you cannot continue. You would have to watch this lesson a couple of times. Now, how is this question linked to the Enneagram? I mean, when I ask the question, why do you have sex? Why is a question about motivation? And the Enneagram, the psychology of the Enneatypes, actually is all about motivation. It doesn't describe the behavior. It's more looking at, why do people behave the way they behave? Why do people think the way they think? So this is why the Enneagram comes very much close to this question of why do people have sex, and it's helping us to answer it. But before we move to the Enneagram, let's maybe look a little bit more in history. How have people answered this question in the past? And you can answer this question from different perspectives. You can look at it from the angle of biology, psychology, philosophy, religion, and so on and so on. But we're going to look now only at biology and psychology. Because the biological one looks actually at the natural reasons for having sex. It's looking at the functions of sex. It's about our animal nature, if I may say so. And psychology is more looking at the human nature of or a human being, or of the human species. So let's start with biology. Biologists, and especially evolutionary biologists, have come up with three main functions. There's a procreational function, the recreational function, and the relational function. So let's start with the procreational function. When we're looking at procreation, there are some organisms that just procreate through cell budding, or they split in cells. I mean, the cell splits itself in half and then the cell becomes bigger, and then this cell division just continues and you have new organisms. But about 1 billion years ago, some organisms started a different way of procreation, sexual reproduction. And we find it in many animal species, but also plant species. And why did they go for sexual reproduction? Well, very simple. It just makes you adapt much more easily to the environment you're living in. Because adaptation is all about changing your DNA, basically changing the way the species are going to be able to interact in a changing environment. And if you're just splitting yourself, basically the DNA remains the same, and it's only these little mistakes in the recreation that are going to lead to some kind of differentiation among the same species. Now, what happens with sexual reproduction is that you have two sources that come together and form a new entity. So by picking some parts from one and picking some parts from the other, you can really adapt genetically much more easily to the environment. Now, what is very interesting is that many religions, and especially Christianity, look at sex only from this angle. They believe that sex is only for reproductive means. And there's actually a very interesting paradox here, because these religions, if you tell them that we humans are just animals, they will get very offended. They consider humans to be some kind of separate thing. We were specially created by God. But actually, they are looking at our sexual behavior as that of some kind of organisms already 1 billion years ago. They don't consider that the evolution of sexual reproduction, as we will see in the next few minutes, they consider that this does not apply to the human species. They basically think that our sexual lives should be the same like a plant or some kind of primitive organisms. But according to these religions, our sex life is not even as developed as that as a rat or an ant or a monkey. So what do I mean with the next stages? Because it's not only about procreation, right? The second reason that I said was the recreational aspect of sex. Not all species are just recreating for procreation. There is also some kind of relaxation that's happening during the sexual intercourse, and especially during the orgasm. What happens during sex is that you're basically putting your mind on some other thoughts. You're just going into, you can even go into another realm. And if we're actually looking, like, how can we explain this in more scientific terms? Basically, we have a central nervous system, which consists of a sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And these two systems are actually out of tune with each other. And it's as a result of being out of tune that we feel stressed, that we feel things are not right, that we're frustrated, that we get itchy, that we're just getting into this reactive mode. And what happens actually is that if the central nervous system would be purely in balance, if the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system would be really in tune, in balance with each other, we would just not be reactive at all. We would be, let's say, zen. Now, what happens during sex is that, or at least during orgasm, is that it's like pushing the reset button. During orgasm, for a very, very short period of time, we bring these two in balance. And this is also why Osho, for example, was saying that orgasm is like enlightenment. This is also why in French, for example, you have orgasm is called the little death, basically because it's the end of a system and it's also the birth of a new system. Basically, it's just resetting the system, as we may say. And actually, you may not have thought about it, but we can see it in our own lives, because many people say that after sex, after orgasm, they fall asleep much more easily. And this has to do with the nervous system that's been reset. Your stress has gone, the anxiety has severely diminished. And the other thing that we can see is that as a result of sex, if you're in, let's say, the normal, the average, or even the healthy ranges, sex is going to lead to temporarily being at a higher level of development even. You're less aggressive, you're more tolerant, you don't get triggered as easily. And this brings us actually to some popular wisdom. In French, there's this word mal baisé, so basically somebody who has not had enough sexual intercourse. And also in many other languages, I mean, you can hear it quite often. An insult would be, oh, this person, she should just, this person didn't have enough sex. And it's some kind of popular wisdom that may sound very rude, but there is a certain reasoning behind it. It's based in a real truth, in a scientifically proven thing. Now, the last function of sex that biologists would come up with is the relational aspect. It's about the bonding, it's about the taking care of each other. And it's something that we find basically in mammal species. What happens during sex, and especially during orgasm, is the production and release of oxytocin, which is called the love hormone. Now, this is a hormone that's also released when a young mother gives birth, and which actually starts a lactation process. Now, what does this oxytocin do? Oxytocin actually leads to us taking care of somebody else. And how has this somehow evolutionary come into existence? Well, basically, very primitive organisms, when they're born, they can just survive, they can live on their own. Some more advanced organisms and animals, when they are born, they cannot stand on their own feet, but they just need their mother, or in some species like some fish, it's the father who's going to take care of them. But some other more developed species are even more complex, and one parent is not good enough. You basically need two parents. You need this biparental care. Now, how are you going to make sure that two parents are going to stay together to take care of the offspring? Because if we're looking, for example, the human species, until the first 5 years of existence, a little child is not able to take care of its own. It really needs at least one, preferably two parents. And if we're looking in many cases, you even need nannies, teachers, and so on and so on. So what happens? During sex, oxytocin is released, and it actually keeps this bonding. It will create this sense that we want to take care of each other. And as a result of that, people are not going to run away from each other. So actually, if now we go back to the instincts, we can see there is some kind of link or a correlation between procreation and the self-preservation instinct, between recreation and the sexual instinct, and between the bonding, taking care, and the social instinct. Now, so these are the three functions of sex. These are the biological explanations, and I will refer to them quite often in this course. So really remember procreation, recreation, and relation. However, that's not all. And I would say the real interesting, and maybe the most important, just starts here. Basically, until the late 20th century, these biological functions were the only thing that people were looking at when we were talking about why people had sex. But also gradually some psychologists became more and more interested because they understood that not everything could be explained that way. And basically they were looking at the question like, what are we looking for in sex? What need does it fulfill? And I just want to give a few names of the first people who were looking into that, and if you're interested you can look up their books or their articles. So for example, already in 1978 there was Paul Nelson, and he was looking at love, pleasure, conformity, recognition and power, and how they relate to sex. And about 20 years later you had Pamela Regan and Carla Dreyer, and they looked at personal motives, social environment, physical environment, and interpersonal motives. And then another 20 years later, so in 2009, you had Frederick Totes. He looked at a very complex interaction of the conscious and subconscious goals, at incentives that are interacting with anxiety, with aggression, attachment, drug taking, and so on. But there's two psychologists that I want to look at in a little bit more detail, because they really did a lot of effort that is going to help us understand how we can link this with the Enneagram. Cindy Meston and David Buss are two psychology professors from the University of Texas in Austin. And they did research on the question, why humans have sex? So very similar to the topic of this lesson. Now, what do? As university professors in psychology, they had access to many students, and basically they asked their students, just write down on a piece of paper, why do you have sex? And they gathered the information from hundreds or even thousands of students, and they just put all of that together. And they just made a list of 237 distinct reasons why people have sex. And they also wrote a few articles and a book like Why Humans Have Sex, or also there's a book called Why Women Have Sex. Very interesting if you want to look at it a little bit deeper. But let's go back to these 237 distinct reasons for having sex. Now, Meston and Bust, they didn't categorize, they just had a long list, but they didn't try to look at how they relate to each other or what is the deeper reasoning behind all of these reasons. Now, for preparing for this course, I had a look at them. And I could see that out of these 237, only 2 reasons related to procreation, 20 related to recreation, and 8 reasons were related to the care. And that even includes the very provocative issue of prostitution as a part of the care. So I got to about 30 out of the 237 motives that are linked to the biological functions of sex. So that's something like 13%. But what about the other 87%? Well, if we are looking at all these reasons from the angle of the Enneagram, I could find that about 60%, that's 142 reasons, somehow correlated with the ego, fixation, or the passion of the different Enneatypes. So for example, something that could relate to type 2 is the reason I had sex because I wanted to feel loved or because I wanted to please my partner. Or maybe specifically for social 2, I have sex because the person was famous and I wanted to be able to say I had had sex with him or with her. Now there is also some that correlate to the 3, for example, just to give a few. I wanted the attention, I wanted to be popular, or I wanted to have more sex than my friends. A few examples that correlate to type 4 are I wanted to display submission, or I have sex because it's considered taboo in my society. So clearly just going against the rules and trying to be unique. Now, something typical for type 7 could be I had sex because I was bored, or because it's fun, or I wanted the adventure and the excitement. Few examples for type 8. I wanted to feel powerful, or I wanted to possess the person, or I felt rebellious. And some that you will immediately see that link to the fixation and the passion of type 9 is it just happened, or it was easier to go all the way than to stop, or I didn't know how to say no. So basically, if we're looking, 142 reasons give some kind of meaning to sex. But actually sex does not have any inherent meaning. If you look in the animal world, they don't have sex for a meaning. So this meaning is very much related to the ego gratification. It's not about the natural function of sex, it's really about our ego and feeding it. So if we're looking, and just for completeness sake, so we had these first reasons that the students gave that are linked to the 3 functions of sex, and we have 142 that relate to the Enneatypes. So there is another 65, and these are very much related to unhealthy approaches to sex. So some students also said that they had sex because out of coercion, because it's a routine, because they're feeling drunk or feeling cold. So now that we looked at this, now is actually the key of the whole course. So the next 5 to 10 minutes, please pay special attention. What are the main takeaways for this lesson, and what is crucial to understand the rest of the course? First of all, every type gives meaning to sex on the basis of their specific ego fixation, on the basis of the specific cognitive misperception of their type. So this is basically how the ego fixations play a role in sex and sexuality and how we give meaning. Now, basically we believe that this is what sex is all about, or to a large extent. But in reality, this is just a distortion of sex. And on top of that, it's not only the types, the Enneatypes, but also the instincts, as we will see later, that give some kind of distortion. So the first takeaway of this lesson is that sex is all about meaning. For animals, there's 3 functions, but I would say for Homo sapiens, there's even a 4th function of sex, and that's ego gratification. Because if we have sex to feel loved, we want to gratify our ego. If we have sex to feel strong, we gratify the ego. If we have sex to feel admired, we basically gratify our own ego. So, if we look to the research of Meston and Buss, 60% of the reasons that students gave were linked to ego gratification, which is actually not about healthy relationships. It's not about connecting. If we take this 60% and these 27% of very unhealthy reasons, then we see that only 13% of the reasons that students gave are linked to the real natural functions of sex. Now, the second takeaway from this lesson is that we give meaning to sex, but sex has no inherent meaning. So what happens? In sex, we are actually looking for something that is not there. And what happens when you're looking for something that's not there? I mean, you imitate it, you think it's there, but it's not there, but still you're going to feel dissatisfied. You'll get this sense of frustration. So basically, people very often use sex as a way to meet their core needs, but they end up being dissatisfied because of it. Now, the third takeaway of this lesson is that when we're looking at meaning, very often people are going to describe it in a way that relates to connection. There's two explanations for that. First of all, we have a very romanticized view on sex. So when people talk about sex, they're saying that they have sex because of love or because it's a merging of the souls and this links somehow to connection, but they don't know what it's really about. And so basically each type that talks about connection is going to talk from the angle of their own ego fixation. Now, the second explanation of how sex is used as a tool for connection relates to the essence. Basically, we use sex in order to get in touch with our own essence and with the essence of our partner. Essence, as you know, is related to the higher levels of development. Now, what happens is the following. In the highest levels of development, we basically feel a very, very strong connection with other people, with the universe, with some kind of godliness, with some kind of super consciousness and so on. And in the lower levels of development, we are completely disconnected. We're so much focused on ourselves, we're focused on our ego. Now what happens in sex is that in sex, we want to get in touch with our ego. We want to get in touch with our essence. We want to get in touch with the higher levels of our own development. So basically, we want to sense this connection. And this is why we talk about connection, but instead of a true connection, we're just imitating this connection. We are demanding this connection from the other, but we're actually not able to establish this connection ourselves. Now, this third takeaway, so about the connection, it's a very important thing, but it's highly philosophical. So please think about it, reflect about it, maybe in your meditations, try to understand what this really means. Now, the fourth takeaway of this lesson is just combining these three previous takeaways, and let's look at the consequences. Now, something you'll know from the Enya types is that we have our own distortion of reality through the lens of our ego fixation. So we have our own view at the world, our own way of looking at things, and we somehow think that this is how everybody looks at it. And the same happens also in sex. Basically, we distort the function of sex through the lens of our ego fixation, and we think that this is how everybody looks at it. We think that this is some kind of universal system of how sex functions, but it's actually not true. So one thing is, of course, that we are dissatisfied when we cannot find what we're looking for. But the other thing is that we start blaming our partner because there's something wrong with our partner, or partner has some kind of weird approach to sex. And we may also get upset that our partner is not gratifying our ego. So what do? Well, we say sexual incompatibility. We just blame it on this incompatibility. But I think that this sexual incompatibility is a little bit of a myth. I think this is a trick of our mind. It's just a way of justifying something. I think that this sexual incompatibility is just a tool for our ego to be able to cope with this sexual dissatisfaction. Because the lower we go in the levels of development, we see incompatibility. But the higher we go in the levels of development, we're talking more about complementarity. And if we're talking about sexual incompatibility, I think there are two alleged types of incompatibility. Now, the first one is related to the ego fixation. Basically, we have different distortions than our partner. We give different meaning to sex than our partner. We're not able to gratify each other's ego. And then I think that this sexual incompatibility is some kind of excuse for the inability and the unwillingness to understand our own distortions, and also for not being able or not willing to understand our partner or where he or she is coming from. So this course should actually help you in this. The entire course is constructed about understanding your own distortions and understanding distortions of your partner. And if you understand it, then it's going to be much more easy to accept your partner the way he or she is. So I hope that this course is going to give you some kind of inspiration to discuss with your partner how you are distorting sex, how you are giving meaning to sex, and how you seek ego gratification in sex. And the more you're able to speak to each other in a very honest way, the more easy it's going to be to find real sexual satisfaction. Now, the second type of sexual incompatibility has to do with the distortion of the instinct. Also, the instinct gives some kinds of meaning to sex, but the second thing is the temperament of the instinct, and this is very much related to the sexual instinct. Because the instincts play a huge role in the intensity of the sexual act. And here, if we have people with different stackings, or especially a different position of the sexual instinct, then people will also feel incompatible. But also here, on the lower levels of development, we're going to experience this difference of instinctual stackings very, very strongly. And the higher we go in the levels of development, the more subtle this is going to become. So the more we're able to recognize this, the more we're aware of these differences, and the more we are conscious about them, the more easy it's going to be to really have some kind of fulfilling sex life. So basically, I hope that now you understand how the motivations of the enneatypes influence our sex life. And if you have not fully understood it yet, please have a look again at this video, because it's very important before we continue with the rest of this lesson.